By mid-1943, the struggle for the Solomon Islands had shifted from Guadalcanal to the jungles and narrow seas of New Georgia and its neighboring islands. The wider Allied strategy, codified as Operation Cartwheel, sought to isolate the large Japanese base at Rabaul rather than assault it directly. One arm of this plan pushed northwest along the New Guinea coast. The other advanced through the Central Solomons, where islands such as New Georgia, Kolombangara, and Vella La Vella formed a chain of stepping stones toward Bougainville and, ultimately, to the approaches of Rabaul itself. Kolombangara, a circular volcanic island with dense jungle and limited flat ground, became a key node in this system. Early in 1943, the Japanese established a base at Vila on its southeast coast and reinforced the island with units from the 51st Division, artillery, engineers, and air defense elements. By June, around 9,000 Japanese troops were stationed on Kolombangara, while 10,500 held New Georgia across the water, under the overall command of Major General Minoru Sasaki. Their task was to protect Munda Airfield on New Georgia and maintain a barrier in the Central Solomons that would complicate any Allied advance toward Rabaul. For the Allies, Munda Airfield was both a tactical and operational objective. Aircraft operating from Munda could threaten shipping around Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands, and support Japanese counterattacks against newly established Allied bases. U.S. Army and Marine units began landings on New Georgia on the 30th of June 1943, eventually committing about 43,000 personnel to the campaign. Their immediate goal was to capture Munda. Their broader aim was to secure airfields and anchorages that would allow further operations up the chain toward Bougainville and beyond. These land operations drew the Imperial Japanese Navy into an intense effort to sustain and reinforce isolated garrisons. Because Allied air power and submarines made daylight transport hazardous, Japanese commanders relied on high-speed night runs by destroyers and smaller craft from Rabaul and the Shortland Islands down the narrow sea lane known to the Allies as the Slot. These runs, dubbed the Tokyo Express, delivered infantry, artillery detachments, engineers, and supplies to Vila and other points, then withdrew before daylight. Several thousand troops, including elements of the 13th and 229th Infantry Regiments, moved in this way between Kolombangara, New Georgia, and nearby bases during July 1943. To oppose these movements, Allied naval forces based around Tulagi and the Russell Islands organized night interception groups built around radar-equipped light cruisers and destroyers. Task Group 36.1, under Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth, with 3 Brooklyn-class light cruisers and accompanying destroyers, had already fought the Battle of Kula Gulf on the night of 5 to 6 July, intercepting one reinforcement run at the cost of the cruiser Helena. The same cruisers, now joined by the New Zealand light cruiser Leander and additional destroyers, would be tasked again with breaking up Japanese movements toward Kolombangara. On the Japanese side, the reinforcement effort in the Central Solomons was coordinated from Rabaul by naval and army staffs that did not always share the same priorities. Naval leaders wanted to delay the Allied advance by holding forward positions as long as possible, even at the cost of shipping and experienced crews. Army planners increasingly favored concentrating resources farther north, judging the defense of the Central Solomons ultimately unsustainable. Nevertheless, orders went out for further reinforcements to Munda via Vila, including a planned movement of about 1,200 troops aboard destroyer transports, to be escorted by a light cruiser and destroyers on the night of July 12th to 13th. For the inhabitants of the Solomon Islands, these strategic decisions translated into sustained air raids, naval bombardments, and the presence of competing military forces on and around their islands. Villages near potential landing beaches were exposed to shell fire aimed at airstrips and supply dumps. At the same time, Allied reconnaissance networks relied heavily on local coast watchers and Solomon Islander scouts, whose reports on ship movements through the Slot shaped both Japanese and Allied risk calculations before each night operation. Thus, on the eve of the Battle of Kolombangara, both sides entered the narrow waters with clear but conflicting objectives. Japanese commanders sought to move another increment of manpower and supplies into the contested New Georgia area, reinforcing positions that were under growing pressure. Allied naval leaders aimed to intercept and reduce those flows at sea, weakening the defense of Munda and supporting the slow advance of ground troops ashore. In the confined channels around Kolombangara, night fighting doctrine, radar, torpedo employment, and the cumulative strain on crews would soon intersect in a brief but costly engagement. In the late afternoon of July 12, 1943, the opening moves toward the Battle of Kolombangara began far to the north, in the harbors that fed the Japanese reinforcement line down the slot. Rear Admiral Shunji Isaki assembled a mixed formation built around the light cruiser Jintsu, 5 destroyers, and 4 destroyer transports. The destroyers Yukikaze, Hamikaze, Mikazuki, Kiyonami, and 1 additional escort provided screening and torpedo strength, while the transports Satsuki, Minazuki, Unagi, and Matsukaze carried about 1,200 Army troops and equipment slated for Kolombangara. Their route led from the northern bases via the Shortland Islands into Kula Gulf, then to Vila and onward unloading points on the western side of Kolombangara. Isaki's instructions reflected the broader constraints on Japanese naval operations by mid-1943. He was to deliver reinforcements that would help stabilize the New Georgia front, and then withdraw his force intact. Heavy cruisers and battleships were not committed. Instead, the mission relied on destroyer speed and the long-range Type 93 torpedoes to deter or defeat any Allied surface force encountered. The destroyer transports, loaded with soldiers and supplies on their decks, had reduced freedom to maneuver and depended on the screening group to absorb the main risk of engagement. Shortly after sunset, Isaki's column turned south into the slot at about 30 knots. The formation was divided functionally into a combat group and a transport group, with Jintsu and the escorting destroyers positioned to engage any intercepting force, and the transport destroyers prepared to detach and race for the unloading point once the Gulf was secured. The Japanese staff expected that Allied forces would again attempt a night interception, as they had a week earlier at Kula Gulf, and they relied on night optics and torpedo salvos to counter radar-directed gunfire. On the Allied side, the opening phase began with information rather than movement. Coast watchers on New Georgia and nearby islands reported the southbound Japanese ships, their estimates confirmed by air reconnaissance. These reports reached Allied headquarters under Admiral William Halsey, who ordered Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth to take his reinforced task group north from Tulagi and intercept the incoming force before it could land troops at Kolombangara. The instructions were clear: prevent the landing if possible, but avoid the loss of additional cruisers after the recent sinking of Helena. At 1700 on 12 July, Ainsworth's task group departed Tulagi. It consisted of the U.S. light cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis, the New Zealand light cruiser Leander, and 10 destroyers organized into 2 squadrons. Destroyer Squadron 21 formed the van with Nicholas O'Bannon, Taylor, Radford, and Jenkins. Destroyer Squadron 12, with Ralph Talbot, Buchanan, Maury, Woodworth, and Gwin, followed behind the cruisers as a rear screen. Together, the cruisers formed Cruiser Division 9. Ainsworth, operating from Honolulu, now commanded a column whose firepower was considerable, but whose doctrine for fighting against mass torpedo attacks was still evolving. Ainsworth chose a route that hugged the western coast of Santa Isabel Island, using the landmass to reduce the chance of detection by Japanese aircraft, while his own ships advanced toward the expected point of contact near the entrance to Kula Gulf. Weather and visibility favored long-range detection. The night was clear, with bright moonlight reflecting off calm seas. These conditions were advantageous for radar and optical spotting, but also increased the risk that muzzle flashes and silhouettes would quickly reveal any ship that opened fire. By 2300 hours, both formations were fully committed to their courses. On Allied ships, general quarters had been sounded, and crews stood at action stations, manning radar scopes, plotting tables, gun mounts, and torpedo tubes. The destroyers in the van prepared to execute Ainsworth's plan: an initial torpedo attack by the leading squadron, followed by concentrated cruiser gunfire once radar identified and tracked the Japanese main body. Behind them, the rear destroyers were assigned to guard against a flanking maneuver or to exploit any disorganization in the enemy line. On the Japanese side, radar was absent, and the opening phase depended on lookouts and the timing of a practiced reinforcement run. The transports needed to remain on schedule to reach Sandfly Bay on western Kolombangara before dawn, unload the troops, and clear the area before Allied aircraft could intervene. Any engagement with surface forces was therefore expected to be brief and decisive, built around torpedo spreads intended to force the Allied ships away from the transport track. Japanese commanders calculated that if they could drive Ainsworth's force off or delay its advance even for a short time, the landing could still proceed. As midnight approached, the two columns converged in the northern approaches to Kula Gulf. Ainsworth's radar operators began to detect contacts at distances beyond visual range, while Japanese lookouts strained to interpret distant smudges and light reflections along the horizon. Neither side yet had a complete picture of the other's formation or intentions, but the essential geometry of the coming clash was set: an Allied column advancing from the southeast, and a Japanese force approaching from the northwest, both committed to reinforcing or interdicting the same narrow sea corridor around Kolombangara. Strategic calculations on both sides framed the coming battle more than any single movement on the plotting boards. For the Japanese High Command at Rabaul, the main objective of the 12th to 13th July reinforcement run was to maintain a viable defense line through New Georgia and Kolombangara long enough to slow the Allied advance toward Bougainville and Rabaul. Each successful delivery of troops and supplies to Vila and onward to Munda Airfield extended the life of that line by days or weeks. The Navy's operational orders specified rapid transport, limited exposure in contested waters, and maximum use of the destroyer force's strengths: speed, torpedoes, and night fighting experience. At the level of Admiral Isaki's task group, these goals translated into a carefully structured plan. Jintsu, as flagship, would lead the combat element using star shell and searchlights to illuminate enemy targets for the destroyers. The screening destroyers were instructed to launch large spreads of Type 93 torpedoes early in any engagement, from long range and across the probable path of an Allied column. The destroyer transports, carrying several infantry companies with light equipment, would hold back until the main force drew Allied attention, then break off at high speed for Vila and the western beaches of Kolombangara. The timetable was tight: arrival at the unloading area after midnight, rapid disembarkation, and withdrawal before dawn. Japanese planners weighed these steps against limited resources. Fuel stocks for destroyers were under pressure from parallel operations along the New Guinea coast and from previous reinforcement runs. Torpedo inventories were still sufficient for massed salvo tactics, but not unlimited. The decision to send a light cruiser as part of the escort reflected the desire to provide heavier gunfire support, while avoiding the commitment of larger ships that might be irreplaceable if lost. The risk was calculated: preserve the destroyer force if possible, but accept attrition if it bought time for the Army garrisons on New Georgia and Kolombangara. On the Allied side, the strategic framework was defined by Operation Cartwheel and by the ongoing New Georgia campaign. Admiral Halsey's South Pacific Command needed to prevent Japanese reinforcement of Munda and Kolombangara in order to shorten the ground battles and reduce casualties among U.S. Army and Marine units inland. Naval surface forces were tasked not only with escort and bombardment duties, but with direct interdiction of the Tokyo Express. Each intercepted convoy translated into fewer Japanese troops and supplies reaching the front, weakening resistance and accelerating the timetable for follow on operations farther up the Solomons chain. Within this context, Ainsworth's task group was assembled as a specialized interception force. Its plan rested on radar-controlled gunnery, coordinated maneuver, and prearranged torpedo attacks. The destroyers in the van were to launch torpedoes as soon as radar fixes identified the Japanese line, then turn aside to clear the arcs of fire for the cruisers. The 3 light cruisers, equipped with modern fire control systems and multiple 6-inch gun turrets, were expected to deliver rapid, concentrated salvos against illuminated targets. The rear destroyers would provide additional torpedoes and guard against any attempt to cross the Allied wake or attack from an unexpected direction. This concept reflected both confidence and recent experience. At Kula Gulf a week earlier, Ainsworth's cruisers had demonstrated the ability to bring radar-directed gunfire to bear quickly in night conditions, but the loss of Helena to torpedoes underscored the dangers of closing too rapidly with Japanese destroyers. For Kolombangara, the task group's doctrine sought to balance aggression with caution, engage at ranges that favored radar and gunnery, maintain a coherent column, and avoid disordered maneuvers that could expose individual ships to torpedo attack. Logistical and technical factors shaped these plans. Allied ships sortied with full magazines of 6-inch and 5-inch shells, and destroyers carried complete torpedo outfits in their tubes. But there was awareness that repeated night actions were wearing down crews and equipment. Japanese ships also sailed with full torpedo loadouts and standard ammunition scales, yet had to factor in the cumulative effect of prior missions on machinery and personnel. On both sides, the strain of sustained operations meant that planning assumed high levels of proficiency that crews might struggle to maintain after weeks of intermittent combat. Intelligence estimates influenced expectations, but contained gaps. Allied reconnaissance gave a reasonably accurate picture of the number of Japanese ships heading south, but there was uncertainty about the exact composition of the force and about whether heavy cruisers might be present. Japanese staff officers anticipated an Allied interception group similar to that at Kula Gulf, but lacked precise information on the number of cruisers and destroyers now available to Ainsworth after recent losses and repairs. Each side expected contact. Neither possessed a complete, verified order of battle for the other. Underlying these operational plans were broader political and psychological pressures. For the Japanese, successful reinforcement runs demonstrated to Army commanders and the home front that the Navy could still support distant garrisons despite Allied advances. For the Allies, disrupting those runs signaled progress in the Solomons campaign and justified further commitments of men and ships. The Battle of Kolombangara thus emerged not from an isolated decision, but from a series of intertwined calculations about time, resources, and strategic momentum on both sides of the conflict. Shortly after midnight on July 13th, the first concrete signs of contact appeared on American radar scopes. Operators aboard the leading destroyers and the cruisers, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Leander, reported multiple targets bearing northwest, closing at high speed. Plotting teams estimated a formation of at least one cruiser and several destroyers, consistent with expectations of a reinforcement run. Ainsworth ordered his column to maintain course and speed, while the van destroyers prepared for a torpedo attack according to the prearranged plan. At approximately 0026, the destroyers Nicholas, O'Bannon, Taylor, Radford, and Jenkins executed their maneuver. Turning slightly to unmask their tubes, they launched spreads of Mark 15 torpedoes toward the Japanese column at ranges between 9,000 and 11,000 yards. After firing, they swung back across the head of the Allied column to clear the gun arcs of the cruisers, as doctrine required. No hits resulted from this initial salvo, but the torpedoes forced Japanese lookouts and helm officers to account for potential tracks in the water, even before visual contact with the enemy ships was fully established. Moments after the destroyer attack, Allied cruisers opened fire based on radar solutions. At about 0030, Honolulu and St. Louis began firing 6-inch salvos toward the leading Japanese contact, soon identified as Jintsu. Leander joined in with her own main battery. The clear night and bright moon aided spotting, while star shells illuminated sectors of the sea ahead. From Jintsu's bridge, the sudden appearance of splashes and star shells signaled that the enemy had achieved both range and bearing before Japanese gunners had a firm visual fix. Responding to the threat, Jintsu's crew switched on searchlights to locate targets and opened fire. Once her beams cut across the water, however, the cruiser became a clearly defined aim point. Allied gunners quickly walked their salvos onto the illuminated hull. Within minutes, Jintsu suffered multiple shell hits along her superstructure and machinery spaces. Fires broke out, and the ship's speed and maneuverability began to degrade. Japanese accounts later noted damage to the bridge and communications, complicating Isaki's ability to coordinate torpedo attacks from the screening destroyers. Despite the pressure on the flagship, Japanese destroyers proceeded with their own torpedo plan. Using optical sightings and reports from lookouts, they closed to favorable firing positions and launched numerous Type 93 torpedoes along the expected path of the Allied column. Some salvos were executed independently as captains judged the moment suitable. Others followed basic guidance to spread fire across the width of the enemy formation. The torpedoes ran silently at high speed beneath the surface, invisible to Allied radar, setting up a delayed but decisive phase of the engagement. As the gun duel intensified, the geometry of the battle shifted. The Allied cruisers, concentrating on Jintsu, maintained a relatively steady course to keep fire control solutions stable. Their destroyers, both ahead and astern, maneuvered to avoid collisions and to maintain screening positions. Japanese destroyers used the partial cover of darkness and the distraction created by Jintsu's illuminated silhouette to adjust headings and courses after launching, seeking to evade shell fire while keeping options open for additional attacks. On the surface, the first phase produced visible signs of damage, primarily on the Japanese side. Jintsu's structure showed the effects of repeated shell impacts, and sections of the ship glowed from fires amidships. Some of her guns remained in action, and she may have fired torpedoes of her own, but her ability to function as a coherent flagship diminished rapidly. The destroyer transports, observing the intensity of fire directed at the cruiser and aware of their cargo, moved to the edge of the engagement area, trying to preserve their ability to continue toward Kolombangara if an opening arose. Around the periphery of the battle, the impact on local observers was indirect but notable. Coast watchers and Solomon Islander scouts on nearby islands reported gun flashes and the distant sound of heavy weapons, confirming that an engagement was underway in the approaches to Kula Gulf. For ground forces on New Georgia and Kolombangara, the night passed without direct involvement, but the outcome of this exchange at sea would influence the pattern of reinforcements and supplies reaching their positions in the following days. By roughly 0040, the first engagement phase had achieved its immediate effect. The Japanese flagship was heavily damaged and no longer a stable command platform, while the Allied cruisers remained operational and in formation. Yet, beneath the surface, dozens of torpedoes were already running their courses toward the plotted paths of Ainsworth's ships. The next stage of the battle would be determined not only by gunnery, but by where and when those unseen weapons intersected with the advancing Allied column. For several minutes after Jintsu fell under concentrated fire, the surface picture appeared favorable to Ainsworth's column. The Allied cruisers were firing effectively. Japanese return salvos were sporadic, and no visible damage had yet appeared among the Allied ships. Then the delayed effect of the earlier torpedo launches began to appear. Shortly before 0040, a Type 93 torpedo struck the New Zealand cruiser Leander on her port side, forward of the bridge. The explosion tore open plating near the boiler rooms, flooded compartments, and disabled part of her power and fire control systems. Around 28 sailors were killed or missing, and many more were wounded by blast and fragments. Leander's speed dropped sharply, and she sheared out of line, forcing the following destroyers to maneuver abruptly to avoid collision, while maintaining some form of screen. The hit on Leander created an immediate command and control problem. She had been the only non-U.S. cruiser in the formation and represented New Zealand's main surface contribution to the action. Damage reports and the need to secure flooding compelled her captain to turn away to the south, escorted by nearby destroyers. This reduced the effective cruiser strength in the line from 3 to 2 and complicated Ainsworth's options for continuing the engagement or attempting a close pursuit of the retreating Japanese. Meanwhile, Jintsu's situation deteriorated rapidly. Fires spread along her superstructure, and additional shell hits disabled guns and started secondary explosions. At some point during this phase, the cruiser either broke in two or suffered catastrophic structural failure amidships. Hundreds of crew members, including Admiral Isaki and most of the staff, were lost with the ship. Survivors later recorded leaving the burning hull in the water amid continued gunfire and the blast of ready-use ammunition, while nearby destroyers weighed the risk of rescue operations against the need to maintain formation and avoid incoming shells. As the Japanese flagship went down, the destroyers that had already launched torpedoes turned away under cover of darkness and smoke. Some shifted course northwest to clear the area. Others prepared to continue toward Vila with the embarked troops. The destroyer transports, carrying approximately 1,200 soldiers, remained the central element of the original mission. For their commanders, the crisis now lay in balancing the obligation to complete the landing against the risk of exposing heavily loaded ships to sustained cruiser fire. For Ainsworth, the battle space became increasingly complex. Radar plots showed multiple fast-moving contacts changing course, while visual observation was hampered by gun flashes, fires, and intermittent use of starshell and searchlights. The damaged Leander and her escorting destroyers represented a vulnerable group that needed protection. At the same time, reports of possible additional torpedo tracks encouraged caution about sudden course changes that might inadvertently steer the column into another salvo's path. Around 1 a.m., further torpedo hits altered the situation again. Honolulu and St. Louis each suffered bow damage from Type 93 strikes that detonated near or under their forward sections. On both ships, the explosions crumpled plating, flooded forward compartments, and forced crews to counter-flood to maintain trim and stability. Casualties included killed and wounded among gun crews and damage control parties working in exposed positions. Despite the damage, both cruisers retained propulsion and power to their main batteries, but their ability to maintain high speed and aggressive maneuvers was reduced. The destroyer Gwin, operating in the rear of the column, was also hit by a torpedo in the vicinity of her engine room. The explosion disabled propulsion and caused heavy flooding, leaving the ship dead in the water. Immediate casualties ran into several dozen killed or missing. Nearby destroyers moved in to assist, launching smoke and preparing to take off survivors. But the immobilized hull became another factor, shaping any decision to remain in the contested waters or withdraw. This accumulation of damage created a crisis of priorities on the Allied side. The original task, intercepting and, if possible, destroying a reinforcement run, now had to be weighed against the risk of losing multiple cruisers and destroyers in confined waters saturated with torpedoes. Damage control teams fought flooding, fires, and structural stress on 3 different ships, while bridge staffs requested updated assessments of their ship's ability to maneuver and fight. On the Japanese side, the crisis took a different form. The loss of Jintsu and the fragmentation of the escort reduced the immediate ability to contest Allied gunfire. However, the torpedo hits on Allied ships suggested that the main defensive weapon had achieved significant effects. Destroyer captains evaluated whether to re-engage, attempt additional torpedo attacks from new bearings, or focus on maintaining the schedule for landing troops at Kolombangara. Communications were hampered by the destruction of the flagship and by radio discipline rules that limited transmissions during combat. In the wider theater, no additional surface forces were close enough to intervene. Air units based on New Georgia and at more distant fields were not in a position to influence this night action directly. The escalation at Kolombangara thus played out with the forces already committed, damaged but still operational, Allied cruisers and destroyers, and a Japanese destroyer group that had lost its cruiser but had succeeded in inflicting significant torpedo damage while still holding the option to continue toward the island that gave the battle its name. Between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., the engagement around Kolombangara reached its most concentrated phase. Multiple ships on both sides were damaged, formations were disrupted, and commanders had to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. The immediate questions for each force were whether to press the fight, to break contact, or to focus on completing the original mission. For the Japanese, landing reinforcements. For the Allies, preventing that outcome while preserving their own ships. On the Allied side, Honolulu and St. Louis continued to fire at radar, and visually acquired targets despite damage to their bows. Their gun crews maintained sustained rates of fire from aft turrets and any forward mounts that remained operable, while damage control teams worked in flooded compartments, sealed off ruptured sections, and monitored bulkheads under stress. The sudden reduction in speed on some ships required adjustments in station keeping. Destroyers in the van and rear shifted positions to screen damaged units, laying smoke at intervals to complicate potential further torpedo attacks. Leander, already hit, moved away under escort, effectively leaving the immediate battle area. Her captain's priority was to stabilize the ship, manage flooding, and ensure that the remaining propulsion allowed withdrawal towards safer waters. The New Zealand cruiser's partial withdrawal reduced Allied firepower in the central sector, and contributed to Ainsworth's assessment that the balance of advantage was no longer clearly in his favor, even though Jintsu had been sunk. For the Japanese destroyers, the peak period involved simultaneous tasks. Some units, such as Yukikaze and Hamikaze, maneuvered on divergent courses to avoid Allied gunfire and to clear the area where torpedoes had just run. Others, particularly the destroyer transports, steered toward Kolombangara according to the pre-planned schedule. Their commanding officers were aware that delays could expose them to daylight air attack and complicate unloading operations on the narrow beaches. Radio traffic remained restricted. So much of the coordination depended on prearranged signals and the initiative of individual ship captains. Around this time, the transport destroyers detached fully from the main action and turned toward Vela and adjacent landing sites. They carried around 1,200 Army personnel, with small arms, light mortars, and supplies packed on deck and in available spaces. The absence of heavy equipment reflected the limitations of high-speed destroyer transport, but the reinforcements were still significant for the garrisons on New Georgia and Kolombangara. While the cruisers and escorting destroyers drew Allied attention, these ships concentrated on reaching the designated disembarkation points. For crews aboard both Allied and Japanese ships, the peak of the battle produced overlapping pressures. Gun crews operated at high tempo, amid blast, smoke, and restricted fields of view. Torpedo teams had already discharged their weapons, but remained at stations in case opportunities for further launches arose. Medical personnel treated wounded on mess decks and in improvised aid posts, dealing with blast injuries, burns, and shrapnel wounds. Communication specialists relayed messages between bridges, combat information centers, and engine rooms, while also monitoring for signals from other ships that might indicate new threats or changes in orders. Local observers experienced the intensity differently. Coast watchers and Solomon Islander scouts observed the concentration of gun flashes and the occasional glow of burning ships on the horizon, noting changes in direction that suggested movements toward or away from Kolombangara's coast. On the island itself, units stationed near Vila and the western shore received advance notice that additional troops might arrive during the night, but the exact timing depended on how quickly the destroyer transports could complete their run through the contested waters. As the clock moved past 1:30, Ainsworth faced a choice between chasing the retreating Japanese escorts and securing his damaged ships. Reports from Honolulu, St. Louis, and Gwin indicated that, although the cruisers could still make headway, their structural condition limited aggressive maneuvering. Gwin's immobility posed a particular challenge, since leaving a disabled destroyer in waters where enemy torpedoes had already demonstrated their reach carried a clear risk. The necessity of organizing possible towing or evacuation operations weighed against any further attempt to seek out and engage Japanese units that were no longer clearly plotted on radar. Japanese commanders confronted a mirrored set of considerations. With Jintsu lost and the escort group weakened, turning back to re-engage Allied cruisers risked further destroyer losses that could not easily be replaced. At the same time, the torpedo hits already achieved suggested that continued exposure might yield diminishing returns. Preserving the destroyer force for subsequent operations and ensuring that the troop landing proceeded as planned became increasingly central to their calculations as the night wore on. By the end of this peak period, the engagement had transitioned from an exchange of concentrated fire and torpedoes to a set of overlapping withdrawal and continuation maneuvers. The Allied cruisers, though damaged, remained afloat and under control. The Japanese destroyers had lost their cruiser, but retained mobility and the ability to deliver the embarked troops to Kolombangara's shores. The intensity of direct combat began to decline, even as decisions taken in this hour would shape the final disposition of forces and the outcome of the reinforcement mission. In the hours after the main exchange, resistance on both sides took the form of keeping damaged ships and strained organizations functioning. Aboard Honolulu and St. Louis, the immediate priority was to stabilize the forward sections where torpedo blasts had torn open plating. Damage control teams shored up bulkheads, pumped out flooded compartments, and jettisoned wreckage and loose gear to reduce strain on the hull. Command functions shifted partly to secondary control positions aft. As bridge crews coordinated altered steering and navigation, with engine rooms compensating for the loss of forward trim. On Gwin, the situation was more precarious. With power lost and flooding spreading from the engine spaces, officers and senior petty officers organized repair parties to rig portable pumps, lay shoring, and move wounded to safer parts of the ship. Ammunition near the damaged area had to be secured or thrown overboard to prevent sympathetic detonations. Nearby destroyers maneuvered close enough to pass pumps, medical personnel, and tow lines, all under the constraint that enemy submarines or a renewed surface threat might appear at any time. The decision framework balanced attempts to save the ship against the risk of exposing more units to danger in a confined area. Leander's adaptation took a different form. With one boiler room flooded and structural damage forward, she had to reduce speed and alter course toward rear areas, escorted by screening destroyers. New Zealand and U.S. officers jointly evaluated whether the cruiser could remain in the South Pacific Theater or would require extensive repairs elsewhere. The incident reinforced for Allied planners the vulnerability of light cruisers in Torpedo, saturated night battles, and influenced later discussions about how to combine radar gunnery with wider dispersal and more flexible destroyer screens. Japanese destroyers, having launched their torpedoes and withdrawn from close contact, now adapted their movements to complete the reinforcement task. The transport destroyers reached Vila and nearby unloading points on Kolombangara's coast in the remaining hours of darkness. Under minimal light and with lookout posts scanning for aircraft and patrol craft, soldiers disembarked with rifles, light mortars, ammunition, and rations transferred by gangways and boats to the narrow beaches. Local terrain and prearranged guides from existing garrisons facilitated rapid movement inland toward prepared positions. The reinforcements integrated into a defensive system that had already been adjusted in response to Allied landings on New Georgia. Japanese Army units improved field fortifications along likely approach routes, expanded supply dumps in jungle-covered ravines, and reorganized their limited artillery to cover both coastal sectors and interior tracks. The newly arrived troops allowed commanders to rotate exhausted companies out of front-line positions and to prepare counterattacks against advancing Allied formations. At the same time, ration scales and ammunition stocks had to be recalculated in light of the uncertain frequency of future reinforcement runs. Morale adapted in complex ways on both sides. Among Allied sailors, the sinking of Jintsu and the observation of heavy fires on the Japanese cruiser confirmed the effectiveness of radar-directed gunfire and reinforced confidence in their ship's gunnery systems. Yet the torpedo damage to 3 cruisers and the crippling of Gwin underscored the persistent threat posed by Japanese destroyers at night. Training officers and staff planners drew lessons about maintaining greater lateral spacing in columns, altering courses more frequently after firing, and assigning destroyers more latitude to launch independent torpedo attacks rather than strictly conforming to cruiser movements. For Japanese crews, reports of the successful landing of troops on Kolombangara provided one measure of achievement, while the loss of Jintsu and heavy casualties among her complement represented a major blow. Destroyer personnel, who had witnessed the cruiser's destruction and participated in limited rescue efforts, carried those experiences back to Rabaul and other bases, where they informed subsequent briefings on Allied radar capabilities and gunnery accuracy. Tactical adjustments included even stricter emission control, greater reliance on high-speed zigzagging during withdrawal, and refinement of coordinated torpedo launch timings to maximize the chances of striking dispersed enemy formations. Local islanders and coastwatchers continued to adapt their own methods. After observing the battle's flashes and the passage of damaged ships, they updated their reporting routes, using hidden paths and canoe channels to pass information on Japanese ship movements and new troop concentrations ashore. Allied commands increasingly integrated these human intelligence reports with aerial reconnaissance and radar data, creating a more layered picture of how Japanese forces were reinforcing and reorganizing on Kolombangara and New Georgia. Within days, both sides began to incorporate the lessons of the Kolombangara engagement into wider operational planning. Allied commanders reviewed the balance between risk to major surface units and the need to interdict every reinforcement run, while Japanese staff officers reassessed how many additional destroyer transport missions could be sustained without unacceptable losses. Resistance in this phase was less about a single clash and more about how fleets, garrisons, and local networks adapted their methods to continue fighting in an environment where each night action could impose disproportionate costs on limited resources. The hours and days after the battle marked a turning point less in a single dramatic decision than in how both commands interpreted the balance between gains and losses. On paper, the immediate outcomes seemed mixed. The Japanese had lost the light cruiser Jintsu and several hundred of her crew, but they had succeeded in landing roughly 1,200 additional troops on Kolombangara. The Allies had kept all three cruisers afloat, but each had suffered damage, and Gwin was so badly hit that she would ultimately be scuttled after her crew was taken off. Casualties in the Allied force ran into the low hundreds killed and wounded. Japanese losses centered on the sunk cruiser and men lost in the water during and after her destruction. When reports reached Admiral Halsey's headquarters, staff officers compared these figures with the operational objectives. The primary goal, preventing reinforcement of Kolombangara and New Georgia, had not been achieved since the destroyer transports had completed their run. At the same time, the sinking of Jintsu and damage inflicted on her escorts confirmed that Allied radar gunnery could inflict serious losses on Japanese surface forces. The question became whether repeated night actions of this type were an efficient way to achieve the broader aims of Operation Cartwheel, given the risk to cruisers and destroyers that could not easily be replaced in the South Pacific. On the Japanese side, headquarters at Withdrawal assessed the engagement through a similar dual lens. The reinforcement mission had succeeded in its narrow purpose. Fresh troops reached Kolombangara, where they immediately entered the defensive system, facing Allied advances on New Georgia. However, the loss of Jintsu and heavy casualties among experienced sailors and officers weakened the already strained 8th Fleet. Destroyers that had carried out multiple reinforcement runs in preceding weeks showed signs of mechanical wear and crew fatigue. Commanders calculated how many more such missions could be attempted before destroyer strength fell below levels required for convoy escort and other duties in the wider theater. These assessments fed into a broader shift in strategy in the Central Solomons. Allied planners, reviewing the battles of Kula Gulf and Kolombangara together, concluded that while radar-equipped cruisers could win individual night actions, the cost in damage and potential ship losses was high compared to the limited tactical effect of sinking single cruisers or a few destroyers, while many destroyer transports still got through. The idea gained ground that it might be more effective to bypass heavily reinforced positions altogether by seizing adjacent islands and establishing new airfields and PT boat bases to interdict Japanese shipping from closer range. For Japanese strategists, Kolombangara reinforced the perception that holding forward positions by continuous reinforcement runs would consume destroyer resources faster than they could be replaced. The reinforcement of Kolombangara extended the defensive line temporarily, but did not alter the overall strategic trend in the Solomons, where Allied air superiority and expanding base network gradually tightened constraints on Japanese movement. The turning point lay in recognizing that future operations would have to balance the desire to hold specific islands against the necessity of preserving the remaining destroyer flotillas. At the tactical level, both sides modified their doctrines. Allied commanders emphasized more flexible destroyer deployment, greater lateral dispersion of cruisers, and closer integration between surface forces and land-based aircraft. Japanese commanders stressed even more reliance on long-range torpedo tactics, avoidance of searchlight use that made ships visible targets, and stricter criteria for when to commit cruisers alongside destroyers in reinforcement missions. Thus, the Battle of Kolombangara functioned as a pivot between two phases of the Solomon Islands campaign. Before it, both navies routinely committed substantial surface forces to night actions in confined waters in an effort to decide the struggle for individual islands. After it, decisions increasingly reflected concern for conserving key ship types and seeking alternative ways to achieve operational goals, whether by bypassing strong points or by redeploying forces to areas where attrition might yield more favorable strategic results. By the early hours of July 13th, the main exchange of fire had ended, but the struggle to extract damaged ships and survivors continued. Ainsworth ordered his force to disengage and retire to the southeast, organizing his column around the practical needs of navigation, towing, and medical care, rather than the ideal battle formation laid out in pre-war manuals. Honolulu and St. Louis, both with damaged bows, steamed at reduced speed, their forward sections sealed and partially flooded. Lookouts watched for additional torpedo wakes, while engineers adjusted ballast to keep the distorted hulls stable in the gentle but persistent swell. Gwin's condition forced a separate set of decisions. Immobilized and heavily flooded, she lay astern of the main group, attended by destroyers that attempted to control flooding and rig a tow. As daylight approached and the risk of air attack and submarine activity increased, her officers and supporting ships weighed the feasibility of bringing a crippled destroyer back through contested waters against the danger of leaving a large, stationary target for enemy forces. After wounded and most of her crew were transferred to other vessels, demolition charges and scuttling procedures were prepared. Later that morning, Gwin was abandoned and sunk by friendly torpedoes, removing the hull from the area, but marking a complete loss in material terms. Medical teams aboard the surviving Allied ships treated hundreds of casualties from splinter wounds, burns, broken bones, and blast effects. Improvised operating spaces were set up in mess decks and wardrooms. Blood plasma stocks, bandages, and morphine were rationed to cover the long return trip to rear bases. Chaplains and senior enlisted personnel assisted in organizing burial at sea ceremonies for those who died after the engagement, while ship's clerks worked to reconcile muster rolls with casualty reports. The damaged cruisers and destroyers moved toward repair facilities in stages. Honolulu and St. Louis initially headed to bases such as Tulagi and Espiritu Santo for emergency work, then onward to larger yards where their bows would be rebuilt. Leander, escorted away from the battle area during the night, proceeded to rear bases in the South Pacific, and then to shipyards capable of undertaking major structural repairs. For weeks and months afterward, these units were absent from frontline task forces, reducing the pool of cruisers available for subsequent operations in the Solomons and elsewhere. On the Japanese side, the destroyers that had completed the reinforcement run did not remain off Kolombangara longer than necessary. After unloading troops and supplies under cover of darkness, they withdrew northward through the slot, making high-speed transits back toward the Shortland Islands and Rabaul. En route, some units conducted limited searches for survivors from Jintsu, recovering small groups of men who had escaped the sinking cruiser. Many others, including Admiral Isaki and much of his staff, were not found. Returning ships reported heavy damage to the flagship, the scale of losses among her crew, and the observed effectiveness of Allied gunnery. For the newly arrived Japanese troops on Kolombangara, the end of the naval battle marked the beginning of their integration into an increasingly pressured defensive situation. Within days, they were distributed among existing formations, strengthening positions along inland tracks and coastal approaches. Supply officers recalculated rations and ammunition allocations to incorporate the added manpower, while medical personnel treated those who had been injured during the night disembarkation or in earlier fighting on New Georgia. The reinforcements provided a temporary increase in local combat capability, even as Allied forces continued to advance toward Munda Airfield. Local maritime conditions also reflected the recent action. Oil slicks and floating debris from Jintsu and damaged destroyers drifted across parts of Kula Gulf, posing hazards to small craft and marking approximate wreck locations. Coast watchers and islanders, who navigated the area in canoes and small boats, adjusted their routes accordingly. Reports of wreckage and occasional bodies washed ashore added to the human and environmental imprint of the battle on nearby communities, even though no major civilian population centers lay directly in the line of fire. As both navies withdrew their ships from the immediate area, the waters around Kolombangara returned, on the surface, to their pre-battle quiet. Beneath that calm, however, lay the consequences of a night's combat. One cruiser lost with most of her crew, one destroyer scuttled, several major units temporarily removed from the order of battle, and more than 1,000 fresh troops now ashore on an island whose strategic value would soon be reassessed by both sides. In later analyses of the Solomon Islands campaign, the Battle of Kolombangara occupied a specific place as an example of how tactical outcomes and strategic effects could diverge. In purely numerical terms, Japanese forces lost one light cruiser and several hundred sailors, including a flag officer and much of his staff, while Allied forces lost one destroyer, saw 3 cruisers damaged, and suffered around 100 fatalities among their crews. Roughly 1,200 Japanese troops, however, reached Kolombangara and were integrated into the island garrison, temporarily strengthening the local defense. For Allied planners, the engagement contributed to a reassessment of how best to use surface forces in the Central Solomons. The combination of radar-directed gunnery and torpedo vulnerability suggested that repeated cruiser-led night interceptions in confined waters would continue to carry high risk for limited payoff. Within weeks, the decision was made to bypass Kolombangara altogether by landing forces on Vela La Vela to the northwest, establishing new positions that threatened Japanese supply routes and rendered the reinforced garrison on Kolombangara progressively less central to the overall campaign. On the Japanese side, Kolombangara underscored the dual role of destroyers as both offensive torpedo platforms and essential transport assets. The successful reinforcement run demonstrated that, under favorable conditions, destroyer transport could still deliver troops into contested areas despite Allied radar and gunnery. At the same time, the loss of Jintsu and continued strain on the destroyer flotillas highlighted the cost of maintaining forward island positions by repeated high-speed runs through increasingly dangerous waters. Over subsequent months, Japanese commands would gradually pivot from reinforcing Kolombangara to planning the evacuation of its garrison, which was carried out later in 1943 using similar night transport methods. For ground campaigns on New Georgia and neighboring islands, the battle's legacy took the form of a temporary increase in Japanese defensive capacity, balanced against a shift in Allied operational design. Reinforcements that arrived via Kolombangara participated in continued resistance around Munda and in delaying actions as Allied units pushed through jungle terrain. However, as new Allied bases came into operation and airfields extended fighter and bomber coverage, the relative importance of any single reinforcement run diminished compared to the cumulative effect of logistical pressure and attrition across the theater. Naval doctrine incorporated lessons from the engagement. Allied navies refined their approach to night actions, placing greater emphasis on dispersed formations, flexible destroyer tactics, and closer integration with air reconnaissance and patrol torpedo boats operating from forward bases. Japanese naval thinkers drew on Kolombangara and similar battles to adjust employment of cruisers, to rely even more on the range and lethality of Type 93 torpedoes, and to accept that surface actions in areas dominated by Allied air power would often have to be limited in scope and duration. In the post-war period, historians and naval analysts used the battle as a case study in the interaction of technology, training, and operational design. The performance of radar, the effectiveness of long-range torpedoes, and the resilience of ship structures under damage all featured in comparative studies by former officers and scholars in the United States, New Zealand, and Japan. Debate continued over how to characterize the outcome, whether as a tactical success for one side, a mutual attrition event, or a strategically inconclusive clash within a larger campaign whose direction had already been set by broader economic and logistical factors. For the people of the Solomon Islands, the long-term significance lay less in the classification of the action and more in its material and environmental traces. Wreck sites, scattered debris, and wartime infrastructure remained on seabeds and shorelines, influencing fishing grounds, navigation routes, and local memory. Accounts from coastwatchers and islanders entered national and regional narratives about the war, emphasizing the role of local knowledge and mobility in a conflict often described primarily through the lens of fleet operations. Taken together, these strands of consequence and interpretation situate the Battle of Kolombangara as one link in the chain of engagements that transformed the Central Solomons from a contested frontier into a region dominated by Allied air and sea power. The battle did not decide the campaign in a single night, but it influenced subsequent choices on both sides about where and how to commit scarce ships, aircraft, and personnel. Its legacy endures in naval history as an example of how modern night combat at sea could inflict significant losses without delivering a decisive change in strategic direction, yet still contribute to the gradual rebalancing of power in a wider theater of war.